Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Thursday, April 27th, 2023. Sorry to have missed the show yesterday, but we're doing a makeup today. Anyways, if you're like me, you're pretty familiar with George Orwell in 1984, describing in excruciating detail how totalitarian governments use the power of language to manipulate the masses. But he certainly wasn't the first. Today, I've got a little from the founders warning along the same lines, not the exact same thing, but along the same lines, how redefining words is a tool for people with power to expand their own power. I'll give you a couple of examples of how they did that with the structure of the Constitution as well. But to kick it off, let's start out with James Madison in his best Orwellian fashion, warning of a metamorphosis of the system if people could just change the definition of the language in the Constitution over time. Here in a letter to Henry Lee in June of 1824, he said, "If the meaning of the text be sought in the changeable meaning of the words composing it, it is evident that the shape and attributes of the government must partake of the changes to which the words and phrases of all living languages are constantly subject." So in other words, as long as Samuel Adams and James Otis Jr. told us back in the Massachusetts Circular Letter of early 1768, they said, "In all free states, the Constitution is fixed." That means not that it can't be changed over time, but the legal meaning of the words in the document are fixed. Like any legal document, the document itself, the words in it mean what the people understood it to mean, the ones who gave it legal force. So under the Constitution, that is the ratifiers, the people of the several states who gave it legal force. And if you change it, if you just have the power, if government has the power to change it as needed or as social issues come up, whatever it may be, that's what the founders called arbitrary government. You couldn't understand what government might do from one year to the next, one day to the next, one generation to the next. And depending on who held power, it might be completely different. That is what they called arbitrary government. And that was one of the grievances that they specifically complained about in the Declaration of Independence. So James Madison saying, if you change the meaning of the words over time, then the document, the structure of the government is going to change over time as well. And I think people with power or people who want to expand power have always looked for that type of an opening. He said, "What a metamorphosis would be produced in the code of law if all its ancient phraseology were to be taken in its modern sense." Modern sense being 1824, in comparison to the ancient terminology of law that they used in many places in the Constitution. Now, some places it was very straightforward and easy stuff, but they were also using 18th century legal terms. James Madison goes on. He said, "Not to look further for an example, take the word consolidate in the address of the convention prefixed to the Constitution. It then and there meant to give strength and solidity to the union of the states." They wanted to create a strong union. "In its current and controversial application, it means a destruction of the states, destruction of the union, and instead by transfusing their powers into the government of the union." So what they were intending to do was make a strong union of states, according to Madison. But over time, what they did was they were absorbing the states into one centralized government. So that's one example that he was already complaining about in 1824. Here from Rob Natelson in an interesting article. I will link to this and everything else in the show notes. I'll publish a blog post a couple of hours after this live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And there you'll find a show link section where instead of saying, "Hey, Bolden dude, where is that link for that Natelson article?" I mean, you can still ask that, but maybe I won't be able to have a chance to get back to you. But you'll find it published over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Anyway, so here's what Rob says. "Despite what you may have heard, the Constitution isn't written in ordinary English, especially in a modern sense. It's written mostly in ordinary 18th century English." And as Madison was talking about, in the early 19th century, if you just take the meaning of the words to mean what they mean at the current time, it could be completely different. For example, well, I'll get into some examples in just a moment. And that was just in 1824. And a lot of people who want to cite the original legal meaning of the Constitution, for example, they go through the right process of trying to define the words as understood at the time of ratification, but they use a dictionary like Webster's 1828 dictionary, which many of the ratifiers weren't even alive to read. So some of the definitions, although it would be more likely to be closer to what happened in 1787 through 1791, they could be far different within just a couple of decades. And Madison was talking about that 4 years earlier. So we want to use, when we want to understand the meaning of these 18th century terms, we want to use dictionaries, both legal and lay dictionaries of the time of ratification. Anyways, Madison, or this is from Nadelson, lots of sons. Uncovering the exact meaning and scope of a word or phrase requires historical, legal, and language skills. It also requires honesty. I think we can all learn these other skills, but a lot of people out there have trouble being honest about what they are in favor of. They really tend to just be on the side of more government power or one political faction rather than the side of truth. It also requires honesty. The researcher has to follow the evidence wherever it leads, not seek or use only sources that promote his own views. Anyways, back to James Madison. So he is really just kind of reaffirming what I'm talking about here. And this is not a new idea for me. I'm basically just reciting what Madison, Jefferson, and others told us. But back to that letter to Henry Lee, Henry Lee. I entirely concur in the propriety of resorting to the sense in which the Constitution was accepted and ratified by the nation. In that sense alone, it is the legitimate Constitution. So understanding the original legal meaning of the Constitution means understanding how the people who ratified it understood it. And the only way to do that is to understand all the debates around it, the arguments for and against, the precursors, etc. Anything else other than that is not legitimate, according to James Madison. Thomas Jefferson, 1 year earlier, in June of 1823, in a letter to William Johnson, says basically the same thing. On every question of construction, carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted, recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text or invented against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed. So here with that just kind of foundation, here's what I see as some of the top ways they've used twisted definitions to expand their power and control. And really, it's just two main ones that have really given them complete and total power, basically arbitrary and unlimited power. And first, we're talking about necessary, the word necessary in the necessary and proper clause. Here's John Williams warning about how this would be used in the New York ratifying convention. He said that some phrases and terms in the Constitution were, quote, indefinite, undefinable terms. And because of that, people with power over time would read them in ways to expand their own power. This was one of the main anti-federalist arguments that it's kind of a subtext, really. But they were concerned, sometimes you'd see in these debates that they would recognize that the legal experts of the time, the great legal minds like James Wilson, etc., well, what they are telling us may be true in the legal sense, but because it's kind of an indefinite term, over time we have to recognize that people with power will always try to expand their power, and if you give them a tiny crack, a foot in the door, they're going to smash it wide open over time. And so this is what John Williams had to say. Whatever they judge necessary for the proper administration of the powers lodged in them, they may execute without any check or impediment. So the key is whatever government determines it thinks is necessary. And that's pretty much what happened. But I think it was even far worse than what John Williams was warning about. Here from an episode that I did covering the necessary and proper clause last fall. When the Constitution was ratified, the word necessary meant, well, necessary. But in just a few short years, 1791, that was changed to convenient or useful, giving the federal government the nearly unlimited power it has today. And really, if you think about that, if something is necessary, that means you can't if something is necessary to carrying out the foregoing powers, the powers delegated to the government and the Constitution, you can't carry out that power without that action. If it's just convenient, it doesn't take a very creative mind, a person with power, some kind of narcissist, sociopath, and generally that's what they are, some kind of socio, to say, well, this is just convenient. Well, this will make exercising my power much easier. And where did that change in meaning come from? Well, it came from Alexander Hamilton, our great buddy, in his push for the national bank in 1791. And here's how Thomas Jefferson responded. He said, "The Constitution allows only the means which are necessary, not those which are merely convenient for effecting the enumerated powers." If such a latitude of construction be allowed to this phrase, he said, as to give any non-enumerated power, it will go to everyone. For there is not one which ingenuity may not torture into a convenience in some instance or other. He also said to take a single step beyond the limits of the Constitution is to take a boundless field of power. To Jefferson, establishing that first national bank, Hamilton's Bank, which Washington unfortunately signed, and Hamilton won that debate because of Washington taking the wrong side on this. Maybe he thought, well, it's going to expire in a number of years anyway, so how bad can it be? I'm convinced it'll be a positive right now. But Jefferson and so many others before him warned us that once you give them the precedent to do something, it's not like they're just going to stop. They're going to use that again and again and again and again and again, and it's always going to get worse. Well, a few years later in McCulloch versus Maryland, Chief Justice John Marshall adopted Hamilton's necessary doesn't mean necessary, it means convenient definition, and in some places, word for word. I will link to that whole opinion and the overview over at Justia, I think that's how you say it, .com, over at in the show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. James Madison, of course, criticized Marshall's definition of the word necessary, meaning convenient, in a letter to Spencer Roane, September 2nd, 1819. He wrote that the Constitution would never have been ratified if it was understood that way. And if we think about the way that Jefferson and Madison and many others told us to read the Constitution, to understand it, how they understood it when they were saying, yes, we're going to ratify, no, we're not going to ratify, however they understood it, whatever side they may have been on, to understand the legal meaning of the term at the time. If we're saying that, well, suddenly now necessary means convenient, and it barely passed places like New York and Virginia, it's very likely the whole thing would have come apart if, well, Hamilton didn't flip-flop. And that's part of why I'm no fan of Alexander Hamilton, even for some of the many good statements and things that he did throughout his career, because I think he was a scammer. He was willing to sell the case of expressly delegated powers, no implied powers. Necessary means necessary, but when it came to the need of expanding powers of stuff that he wanted government to do, he was happy to flip-flop within just a few years, even if it was super, super obvious. Anyways, again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty is where I'm going to link to all these original source documents and articles. And I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat while I'm here for just a moment. There's Vincent in Tampa. Good to see you, buddy. Senator DT, Dave Simmons, Dixie Strong, Alt Reality, King Nobody in Colorado, Natural Law, which I always love your screen name, Douglas Fox in Tennessee, and everyone else. Thank you guys so much for being here. I appreciate you leaving comments, whether it's live or in the archive or reviews on Apple Podcasts, smashing the like button. All that stuff helps tell the platforms that, other people should check us out. And in some situations, it will actually trigger the algorithm and tell them to show us to more people. Thank you so much. Anyways, back to it. So Samuel Adams, in a letter to John Pitts in January of 1776, put it this way: "How strangely will the tools of a tyrant pervert the plain meaning of words." And I think that's a great way to describe what they did with the word necessary. And today, we are surrounded by tyrants, and we're surrounded by tools all over the place. I think that should be pretty obvious. People who are just willing to sacrifice their own liberty, the future of their family, the future of their family's liberty, the economy, etc. They're willing to do that to support a tyrant. And it's very, very, really a sad situation. I mean, we're lucky to be alive, to be able to try to do something about it or set a foundation for future generations. But Samuel Adams recognized this back in 1776. And again, that's a great way to describe perverting the plain meaning of the word necessary. The idea that the word necessary means something like convenient, not even close to necessary. Convenient is nowhere even related to the definition of that word. But they've also done that, of course, on the Commerce Clause. And here again from another article by Rob Natelson, which I will link to in the show notes. He said, for the nation's first 150 years, and maybe this is just a generalization, the courts and almost everyone else understood that the Interstate Commerce Clause, that's what we'll call it, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, gave Congress authority only over certain economic activities, particularly mercantile trade, and only when those activities extended across state lines. So that's important. At first, the phrase, we're not just talking about a single word, but we can also look at words like regulate and commerce to understand how they've manipulated and expanded and changed definitions. And the people have either been dumb and just gone along with it, they don't really understand, they don't care, or they've actually begged for government to have more power. And we see this happen still today. They either are ignorant, they don't care, they're ambivalent, or they're the bad guys. They're begging for government to do more that it was never authorized to do, that it was stupid to authorize them to do, that it's dangerous to authorize them to do, destructive. So they specifically understood regulating interstate commerce as covering literally, primarily mercantile trade that went across state lines. But over time, well, here's how he put it in another article. Since that time, however, several writers favoring a more interventionist federal government have claimed that the founders understood the word commerce to be a much more comprehensive term. Thus, in 1937, think of the time, FDR, New Deal, court packing type of time. Walton Hale Hamilton, another Hamilton, and Douglas Adair. I wonder if there's a relation. I don't think so. Walter Hale Hamilton and Douglas Adair argued that the founders understood the word commerce to comprehend all economic relationships, including production as well as trade. So even though the founders, if you looked at the definition of the time, primarily talked about commerce meaning trade, and you can actually do studies and see how, not just in dictionaries, but in context and articles and speeches and debates and things like that, newspaper columns, you can see how they use the term. And even though they use the term to primarily discuss mercantile trade, and then for the clause itself, they were only giving the federal government the power to regulate, not prohibit, trade that went across state lines. Suddenly, in the FDR era, that meant not just trade, but everything, including production as well as trade. Rob writes that the effect of adopting this view is to authorize, even without resort to the necessary and proper clause, congressional regulation of all economic transactions, triggering interstate externalities, which for practical purposes means the entire American economy. So they don't even have to. They've, just like they do with surveillance powers, they may say, well, we've shut down the Patriot Act, Section 215, Call Detail Records Program, but maybe they're not even using that so-called legal authority as their basis for their mass warrantless surveillance. They also have an executive order, 12333. They also have FISA, Section 702. So they like having different ways that they can actually lean on legal arguments to claim more power for themselves on surveillance. They certainly do that when it comes to just general power to control just about anything and everything. So on the one hand, they've given themselves almost unlimited power by calling necessary convenient. On the other hand, they've got a backup just in case that doesn't play out. Or maybe it's the other way around. Now suddenly commerce doesn't mean trade across state lines in the Interstate Commerce Clause. It now means anything, pretty much anything. That was as of 1937. But then it gets even worse. Rob writes that two currently active scholars, Jack Balkin and Akhil Amar, go even further. They contend, and this is not the previous one, the New Deal one is generally the widely accepted one in the legal world, in the government, by politicians, in the courts, etc. So that's how they're basically letting it play out in practice, and the people are allowing it, or, like I said, begging for it. But they're pushing, it's not enough. Because we know that power is always expanding. Power always seeks to expand and grow. As Abigail Adams warned us, Power, whether vested in many or a few, is ever grasping. It always seeks give more and more and more. I forget exactly how she put it. It's a pretty awesome letter that she wrote. But anyway, so now they're trying to expand commerce to mean even more than what the incorrect, expanded, twisted meaning of it was from the FDR era. And Rob writes that two currently active scholars, Jack Balkin and Akhil Amar, go further. They contend that as understood by the founders, commerce actually denoted human actions of all forms, economic and non-economic. So anything. Sitting around and doing nothing, as we may understand, is somehow doing something. They argue that during the 18th century, the word commerce was interchangeable with the word intercourse, and that either could denote all social relationships. Under this view, the Constitution empowers Congress to regulate all social interchange, generating externalities across jurisdictional lines subject only to Constitution's itemized limits, such as the Bill of Rights. Now, I need to do at some point an argument or not an argument, but an episode covering the argument about whether or not to have the Bill of Rights. Now, in many cases, the Anti-Federalists were right about the way that things were going to be twisted. But in some ways, the Federalists were also right. And I think some of them, when they were warning that, well, if you add a Bill of Rights, you are kind of opening things up to flipping the entire system upside down, as if instead of the government is only authorized to do the stuff that's written down here in the Constitution, if you add that to it, they might see it as, well, they can do anything other than what's specifically spelled out that they can't. And that's the way that it's being pushed now. And it hasn't gotten there completely yet, but we know there are some legal experts that are pushing for this approach. And I think over time, if people don't wise up, that's the way it's going to end up. Anyways, John Williams had a little to say about this, of course, as well. Here he is again in the New York Ratifying Convention. Ingenious men may assign ingenious reasons for opposite constructions of the same clause. So it doesn't take, again, smart people who want power, sociopaths, people with borderline personality disorder, people with personality disorders who really hate humanity, have no problem lying and twisting and expanding power for their own, well, benefit. Here's John Dickinson. All artful rulers, he wrote, who strive to extend their power beyond its just limits, endeavor to give their attempts as much semblance of legality as possible. Now think this, I'm just covering necessary and proper and the Commerce Clause. And these two on their own, basically the way that it's being argued to us, gives the federal government almost completely unlimited power. And if you think about the real root cause of the American Revolution, it's the Declaratory Act of 1766, with people like John Hancock and Thomas Paine pointed out during crucial times that even if they do the right thing on this one issue, if they back down on this tax, they make a deal once the fighting has started, they still claim the power over us in all cases whatsoever. And that's why they urge the people to push on, Thomas Paine specifically, no matter how difficult it was in December of 1766, because no matter what they do today, December 21, 1776, no matter how hard it might seem, if we give up today, they claim the power over us in all cases whatsoever, and no one has unlimited power like that. We can't allow that. And that's very close to what we have today. And if we're not there already, it's so close, it's almost unrecognizable. And that's just discussing how they're misrepresenting, twisting, and misusing language to expand their own power by changing the meaning of the word necessary and changing the meaning of the word commerce and people going along with it. Just 2 words. Just think of all the other ways that they've done this. I mentioned the Patriot Act. It was passed in a manipulative way, in a state of fear and war and terrorism. And so if you oppose something that was patriotic, you were unpatriotic. So it was a way to rally support. Or so-called emergency powers, especially in just the last few years. But you can go all the way back to the Emergency Banking Act and things like that. They suspend or limit one part of the Constitution or another as long as people keep living in fear and under the belief that government is going to protect them. We're sure to see more and more of this kind of thing in the years to come. Here's from John Whitehead over an old article over at the Rutherford Institute. Again, I will link to this in the show notes. He said, once again, we find ourselves reliving George Orwell's 1984, which portrayed in chilling detail how totalitarian governments employ the power of language to manipulate the masses. In Orwell's dystopian vision of the future, Big Brother does away with all undesirable and unnecessary words. I wanted to highlight that just because, well, it was fun to put unnecessary in there after this discussion. Undesirable and unnecessary words and meanings, even going so far as to routinely rewrite history and punish thought crimes. Again, this all sounds very familiar, and even if the Orwellian vision is a bit dramatized, maybe in some ways it's even worse today. Anyways, John goes on. He says, where we stand now is at the juncture of old speak, where words have meanings and ideas can be dangerous, and new speak, where only that which is safe and accepted by the majority is permitted. The power elite has made their intentions clear. They will pursue and prosecute any and all words, thoughts, and expressions that challenge their authority. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational, more important than anything. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something. I hope you're having a great day. I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. If you want to help us reach and teach more people about the original legal meaning of the Constitution, how to defend and support the Constitution and liberty when government refuses to do so, which is 24/7, 365, nothing helps us get that job done more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members is the direct link to sign up as a member. We have the monthly option at just $2 a month. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Don't feel obligated to join us, but if you've got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, throw it our way. We will use it to continue building a foundation, person by person, step by step, brick by brick, and state by state for the Constitution and liberty. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I hope you're having a great day. Schedule-wise, I will probably not do a live show first thing tomorrow morning. I might do one later in the evening. My schedule is a little bit off this week. I'll either do my Fast Friday show on Friday night or Saturday morning. We'll see, but I'll give an update on the platforms once I'm able to get that scheduled. Again, thank you for being here, and I hope to see you next time on the Path to Liberty.